Hello viewers, welcome to this video. In this video, we're going to be looking at role-based access control RBAC. Few users asked me to do a video on role-based access control, so I'm doing this video today. So what we'll be looking at today is how to create users, how to generate certificates to authenticate with Kubernetes API server, and how to give access, restricted access to some namespaces. All right, so in this video I'm going to be creating a user called John. By the way, when I say user group, Kubernetes cluster is not aware of any concepts like user or groups. It only cares about the certificates, right? So if you provide during the authentication, if you provide the proper certificate, then you will be allowed access into the cluster, and depending on the roles that you define in your cluster, the user can do certain things. You can restrict users what the user can do in your cluster by defining some roles. So that's what we are going to see in this video. So for this demo, I'm going to be creating a user called John, and I'm going to give John access to a namespace, a particular namespace, not the entire cluster, but just a particular namespace. So we'll be creating certificates. So the first thing we'll be doing is we'll be creating a private key for John, and then we'll be creating a certificate signing request, and we also need the Kubernetes certificate authorities private key and the certificate in order to sign John's certificate. All right, so once we sign the John's certificate, John will have the private key and the certificate, john.crt, john.key. So those two are the key pairs, so private key and the certificate that he needs to log into or use kubectl commands. So in Kubernetes, you can grab these two files from your master node. So they will usually be under etc kubernetes pki, and we will look at that in a short. So okay, yeah, so we've got namespaces. So I'm going to create a namespace called finance in my cluster, and I want to give John access only to the finance namespace, not to anything else. So what I'll be doing is I'll be creating a role. So there is a difference between a role and a cluster role. A role applies only to a particular namespace, whereas a cluster role, whatever you define in your cluster role, that applies to the entire cluster, to all the namespaces. So basically when you create a role, it's something like you define rules. So you say what is allowed, what a user is allowed to do in that particular namespace. So for example, there are like three different things: API groups, resources, and verbs. Verbs are like what he can do: get, list, watch, update, delete, and so on. So there are lots of verbs. And resources, so these are the actions: get, list, watch, update, delete. And the actions should be performed on these resources: pods, deployments, replica sets, daemon sets. So those are resources. And API groups, there is a core API group, for example, the pods. So this pods comes under the core API group, and deployments, replica sets comes under the apps API group, and so on. So there is the networking API group. So we will look at how to create a role using all these things. And once we create the role, so role gives access to a particular namespace, what they can do in that namespace. And you also need to bind that role to a particular user, so that that user can do whatever he wants based on the rules that we define in the role on a particular namespace. All right, so that's one thing. And in the same video, in this video, I'm also going to show you, for example, if you've got hundreds of users, you don't want to create role and role bindings for each of the user. So for example, I'm creating a role saying this role can list pods in the finance namespace, and I don't want to create that role binding for 100 users. So in that case, what I'll be doing is I'll be creating a group. I won't be creating a group, but when I'm creating the certificates, I'll show you in a minute how to do that. So basically you are binding that role to a particular group. So any user member of that group will inherit that role. So you don't have to bind the role to every single user. All right, so that's the theory, and let's dive into the demo. All right, so cd to play, and I'm going to cd to a temporary directory. Let me open up another terminal, cd to play, and then to temp. Okay, so I've got a Kubernetes cluster running, kubectl version The server version is 1.16.2. My cluster is 1.16. kubectl get nodes. I've got one master node and two worker nodes. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a namespace called finance. kubectl create namespace finance. Alright, so kubectl get namespace. So we have that finance namespace. And I'm going to create the certificate and key pair for the user John. Okay, so the command is I'm going to use OpenSSL command. OpenSSL gen RSA minus out. So the file that we are going to create is the private key. Let's call it John. So we are creating this key for John. So john.key and the number of bits, either 2048 or 4096. Let's go with 2048 bits. Alright, so if I do an ls, so that's John's private key, cat john.key. So that's John's private key. So now we are going to create a certificate signing request. Alright, so OpenSSL request minus new minus key john.key. So we are going to use the private key we created in the previous step, and minus out john.csr. So that's the certificate signing request, and minus subject. So this one is important here. So cn is John, so that's the user, and uppercase O equals finance. So that makes him a member of the group finance. So that one is very important. Alright, so we've done that. So now we've got the private key, we've got the certificate signing request, and in order to sign this certificate, John's certificate, we need the certificate authorities certificate and the private key. So if I log into my master node, cd to etc Kubernetes PKI, and if I do an ls, so here we have ca.crt, ca.key. So those are the two files we need for signing John's certificate. So I'm gonna copy those, scp root at kmaster etc Kubernetes PKI ca.cert and ca.key to my current directory. Alright, so we have those two files here. So now I'm going to run an OpenSSL command to sign his key 509 minus, it's a new request, and the file is john.csr. we are going to send John's certificate signing request minus ca, that's the ca certificate, minus ca key, ca.key, it's all in my current directory, minus ca create serial, minus out, we want John's certificate, and let's say the certificate's validity is 1 year, which is 365 days. If you want, you can say 10 years. Okay, so that's done. And if I do any ls, so we have John's certificate and John's private key. So we have all we need. So now there are a couple of ways. We need to create a kubeconfig file so that John can access our Kubernetes cluster. Alright, so there are a couple of ways to create kubeconfig file. Either you can send the certificate and key to John, and John can create Kubernetes config file himself, or we can create the kubeconfig file for John and we can send the kubeconfig file and then he can start using it straight away. I'll show you both the methods. So first, let's say we want to send John the key and ask John to create the kubeconfig file himself. So the files that we want to send to John are the CA certificate, John's certificate, and John's private key. So those are the only three files John requires to create a kubeconfig file. So assume that I'm John now, I'm not a cluster admin. I'm John, so I've got access to the certificate, John's certificate and private key. So now I'm going to create a kubeconfig file. So I'm going to use kubectl minus minus kubeconfig. I'm going to say, I'm going to name my kubeconfig file john.kubeconfig, config, set cluster, name of the cluster minus minus server, my server, which is 172.42.42.100:6443 minus minus certificate authority is ca.cert. So he already has access to ca.cert. So that's the cluster. So if you want to know what's your Kubernetes cluster server is, if you do kubectl config view, you will have your server here. So that's the server that I used here. All right, so we've done this command kubectl -kube config. We are specifying what kube config file we are going to use, and then using the config option set cluster, we are creating a new cluster. We are setting up a new cluster in the kube config, giving it a name, the URL of the Kubernetes API server, and then the certificate authorities certificate. So that's done. So the next command is we need to add the user to this kube config file. kubectl -kube config john.kubeconfig config set credentials. We are setting the credentials for John, and we need to pass in John's certificate and John's private key. Client dash certificate has to be a fully qualified path. So minus home venkat n play temp john.crt and minus client dash key is john.key. All right, so that's done. User is set. So now we need to set the context. kubectl -kube config john.kubeconfig config set context. We are setting a context called John Kubernetes. It can be any name, and the cluster he's going to connect is Kubernetes. The command that we did before this command was setting up the cluster, and we gave the name Kubernetes -- namespace finance. So we are going to give him access only to the finance department, finance namespace, and -- user is John. Okay, so now there is this kube config file john.kubeconfig. If I take a look at john.kubeconfig, so that's his simple kube config file. So the certificate authority is ca.cert, client certificate, client key is John's certificate and private key, and the name of the context is John Kubernetes, user John, and the namespace he will use by default is finance. The cluster is Kubernetes. The cluster's address is here. So we've got everything ready, and one other thing we need to change is in the current context, change that to John Kubernetes. Okay, cool. So our kube config file is ready. So I'm John now, so I can copy john.kubeconfig to my .kube directory under my home directory as a config file. So I don't have to prefix --kube config. So I can just run kubectl, but because I'm using the same machine, I'm going to pass in --kube config john.kubeconfig get pods, for example. There you go. So he has successfully authenticated with the API server, but he hasn't got any permissions. So that's where we need to define the role, saying what John can do in our cluster. All right, so listing pod is forbidden, so he can't list pods in the namespace finance. So that's okay. We'll come to that in a minute. So that's one way. Okay, so I'm going to delete his kube config file. So that's one way. You send the certificate authorities certificate, John's certificate, and John's private key to John, and he has to run those three commands: set cluster, set credentials, set context, and then he can access the Kubernetes cluster. Or if you're not worried about sending all those certificates, all those keys to him, and if you want to create everything yourself, and then just send the kube config file, and then he can start using it right away. The way to do that is to okay, so we don't have John's kube config file. I'm going to create a new file for that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy my existing kube config file, and then we will edit it. It's better to start from something instead of starting from scratch. All right, so that's my kube config, cluster admin's kube config, and we are going to edit john.kubeconfig. All right, so cluster, so that's the certificate certificate authorities certificate. So we're not pointing to any particular file. We are baking in the data, the actual certificate inside the kube config file, so that we don't have to send John all these files. All right. So name is Kubernetes. We have got the server address, context, user. I'm going to change the user to John. Name of the context, change the name of the context to John-Kubernetes. Current context, change that to John-Kubernetes. All right, and user, change the user to John. Okay, so now we have this client certificate data. Delete everything. And client key data, delete everything. So we are going to paste in the actual certificate and the private key inside the kube config file. So we don't have to send any keys or any certificates to John. It's sufficient. It's just that this kube config file is more than enough for him. Just send this kube config file and then he should be able to access your cluster. So for that, we need to paste in our certificate, John's certificate, and John's private key. We can't paste the certificate as it is. We need to encode it before we can paste it here. So for that, I'm going to use base64 to encode it. So we have John's certificate. If I do cat john.crt and pipe that to base64, so that's base64 encoded certificate for John. But if you look here, there's a line wrapping at column 76 for. So basically, we need to ignore that line wrapping. We don't need the line wrapping. For that, cat john.crt, pipe that to base64, and then use the option -w0. So that's going to ignore, and it's not going to wrap your lines. Cool, that's great, and copy that. Everything except the last %sign and paste it here. Right, that's done, and let's do the same thing for John's private key. John.key base64 w0. Let's copy that. Okay, copied. And paste it here. Cool, that's all. Save the file, and there we go. So we have john.kubeconfig. Let me clear the screen here. Okay, if you just send this, file john.kubeconfig to John, and he can put it inside his .cube directory as a config file, and then he can start using the kubectl command. Let's verify. kubectl ---- kubeconfig john.kubeconfig get pods. Cool. The authentication bit is working fine, and now we need to decide what sort of access we are going to give John in our cluster. For that, we need to create a role. So I'm going to create a role now. kubectl create role, and if you want some examples, you can look at the help option and grep for kubectl. So there are a few examples here how to create a role, and let's pick one of them. kubectl create role. I'm going to call this role John Finance --verb equals he can get, he can list, resource equals pods, namespace is finance. All right, so we've created a simple role. If I do kubectl -n finance get role -o YAML. So under the core API group, he can get and list pods. That's all he has got access to. Okay, and then we can finally fine tune what other access he needs. All right, so we've created a role. Now we need to attach this role to John. So that is done by role binding. So similarly, we can do a role binding. kubectl create role binding. I'm going to call this role binding John Finance role binding. And the role is the role that we created in the previous step, which is John Finance. --user is John, we are assigning this role to John, and minus minus namespace is finance. Okay, so we've got role bindings. And if we take a look at the role binding, kubectl minus n finance get role binding John finance role binding minus o YAML. So that's the role binding. It's applicable for the namespace finance, and the role we are assigning is John dash finance, and the subject is user, who is John. So we are assigning this role to the user John. Cool. So now user John can list pods in the finance namespace. Let's see if that's true. kubectl minus minus kubeconfig john dot kubeconfig get pods. Pod is forbidden. User John cannot list resource pods in the API group in the namespace default. Okay, so there's something wrong. Let's go ahead and edit that config file. Sorry, the role kubectl minus minus n finance edit role John finance. Okay, so rules API groups, I'm gonna say, let's say star resources pods verbs get list in the namespace finance. Okay, let's save that. kubectl minus minus kubeconfig john dot kubeconfig get pods. Pods is forbidden. User John cannot list resources. Alright, so I know what the problem is. It's trying to get the pods from the default namespace. He hasn't got access to the default namespace. So to fix this, open his kubeconfig file. Under the context, the default context for him should be finance. So set namespace to finance, save that. And now if I do kubectl minus minus kubeconfig john.kubeconfig get pods, cool. So that has worked because we haven't got any pods. It says no resources found in finance namespace. So if he tries to get the pods in kube system namespace, for example, he will get error access denied, forbidden. Okay, so what else he has got access to? kubectl kubeconfig john.kubeconfig get, can he get service? No. Can he get deployment? No. Okay, let's edit the role again to give him additional permissions. kubectl minus n finance edit role John finance. Let's say pods and then deploy and then service get and list. Save that. kubectl minus minus kubeconfig john.kubeconfig get deploy. Nope. Get service. Nope. Alright, let's edit the role and say all resources basically. I'm gonna put an asterisk, which means all resources, and get and list. Okay, so now if I do get service, yep, no resources found in finance namespace, get deploy. So now he can get deployment. In fact, we can do get all. Yep, so he has got access to everything. Let's try if he has got access to creating a namespace. So in the role we've specified he can only get and he can only list all the resources in the finance namespace. But what if he wants to create a deployment? For example, kubectl create deploy nginx minus minus image nginx. Nope, that's access denied. So let's edit the role again, and let's say let's add him full access dash and put an asterisk, so he can do anything he wants to any resources, any API groups in the finance namespace. Save that, and now if I do create deploy nginx, deployment created. Alright, so john.kubeconfig get all, container is getting created. Let's see if he has access to deleting the deployment. Delete deploy nginx, that's done. Get all, cool, so that's getting terminated. Cool. So that's how you add a role to a user. So that's fine. So we've added one user. If I show you the role binding, kubectl -n finance get role binding. All right. So as you can see here, if you create more and more users, and if you want to give all the users access, the same level of access that John has, you will keep adding the subject. Under subjects, you will keep adding all the users here. So if you've got hundreds of users, you'll be adding all the users here, and this file, the role binding file resource, will get so much bigger. So that's when you will use the group. So when you created the certificate, when we created the certificate, we specified the subject as CN equals John and uppercase O equals finance. So by default, John is now a part of the finance group. So if you add additional user to the finance group, and we can attach this role to the finance group so that you don't have to add users to this role binding. So you just attach the role to the group, and whenever you add any users that belong to the finance group, will inherit this, inherit the permissions from this role. All right. So what I'm going to do now is, so we have John. So what we did for John, we created this certificate, we've created the key, we've created the kube config file and everything. So I'm going to create additional user, another user called Chris. I'm going to pause the video. I'm going to create a user called Chris. Basically, I'm going to follow the same steps that I shown earlier in this video, and I'll come back when I've created that user. All right, so I've created the certificate for the user Chris. So Chris certificate and Chris private key is here. So now let's go ahead and create the kube config file for Chris. kubectl minus kube config chris.kubeconfig set cluster. It's going to be the same kubectl -kube config chris.kubeconfig set credentials Chris, and pass in the client certificate and the client private key. Finally, kubectl -kube config chris.kubeconfig set context Chris Kubernetes cluster Kubernetes namespace is finance, user is Chris. Okay, and if I edit chris.kubeconfig and change the current context to chris-kubernetes. All right, cool. So we've created a new user, and this user is also part of the finance group, so we don't have to do anything about, but actually we haven't changed the role binding. So still the role binding is bound to the user John. Okay, that's good. So let's test it first. kubectl -kubeconfig chris.kubeconfig. So I'm gonna ask Chris, I'm gonna see what access I've got in the cluster. Get pods. Cool. So user Chris, he can't, so that's expected, right? So he can't list the pods in the finance namespace. So we need to create a role. We need to bind that role to the to this user Chris. Or what you can do is we can attach the role to a group, to the finance group. kubectl, let's delete the existing role binding first. kubectl -n finance delete role binding John finance role binding. Let's call it a more generic role binding. kubectl create role binding. So that's the command that we used previously to create the role binding. We already have the role. We don't have to touch the role. We are just editing the role binding. So let's call this role binding finance role binding, and role is John finance. And instead of user John, I'm going to say group is John. Instead of user, say group is John, namespace, sorry, group is finance, namespace is finance. All right, there's some error in the command. --group equals finance. There's a typo here. Create role binding. All right, so our role binding has been created. kubectl -n finance get role binding. doesn't have the resource role binding. Again, a typo. I don't know, I'm making too much typo this time. kubectl -n finance get role binding John finance. Oh, we've changed the name of the role binding. It's now finance role binding. Yep, so now you can see the subject is group name is finance. So now Chris should be able to access our cluster. He should have the same set of permissions as John. kubectl -n, sorry, minus kube config chris.kubeconfig get pods. Cool, he's got access now. Let's try and create a deployment. Create deploy nginx get pods. He can create pods, and kubectl delete deploy nginx get all. Yep, that's getting terminated. Cool. So that's how you create users, you generate certificates, you create role bindings, and you assign role to a particular group, and any user you add to that particular group will inherit the permissions from the role that you attached to that group. Alright, so I think that's all I wanted to show you in this video. Alright, so hope you found this video useful. Please give this a try and let me know if you've got any issues. I should be able to help you, and please share and subscribe. I will see you all in my next video. Bye bye.